The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our presentation today, and thank you so much for making the time to join us. I'm Tracy Butcher, the Outreach Director for Wildlands Network, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Katie Davis, our Western Wildway Program Director. Katie was born and raised in Salt Lake City. She enjoyed a childhood filled of camping, boating, and hiking, and has forged a very rewarding career in environmental policy before she joined Wildlands Network in 2016. As Western Wildway Director, Katie advances public lands and connectivity policy initiatives by collaborating with Western Wildway Network partners and providing on-the-ground leadership to campaigns and projects. The presentation will provide an overview of Wildlands Network's leadership and conservation strategy in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, specifically focusing on the momentum and progress we've achieved in the last year. It will highlight the challenges we've continued to face because of the border wall, but it will also address how we're trying to minimize and prevent the damage from this destructive barrier throughout communications, lobbying, and coalition building. So without further ado, it's my privilege to introduce Katie, and thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to giving you an overview of our Borderlands program. This webinar is going to cover just a little bit of the past of the Wildlands Network's work in the Borderlands, as well as talk you through a couple of key projects that we're working on right now, and give a little bit of a preview of what we look forward to working on the rest of this year and moving forward. I just want to give a couple of notes initially. In terms of questions, you should see a box on your right-hand side of your computer screen or wherever the control panel is located, where you can type in questions. Feel free to do that at any point during the presentation, but we will save questions until the end. So I won't be answering them yet, but by all means type them in and then we'll get to them at the end. And then as well, you can type them in at the end if you have questions at that point. I also just ask a little bit of patience in case we have any technological issues. I'm also recovering from a cold. This is our first public-facing webinar. So please just bear with us and we will work them out together. So thank you so much. So first, I just want to get started, give a brief overview of Wildlands Network's Borderlands history. So for over a decade, we've been working together with stakeholders in the Borderlands region of the southern United States and northern Mexico. We focused on long-term conservation planning and advocacy, looking to protect corridors for wildlife movement and looking to connect core areas of wildlife habitat. As you can see from the map on the left of your screen, this is the area that we're really defining as the Borderlands area region for our work. It consists of Sky Islands region specifically. The Sky Islands are mountains that are rising out of the desert and grassland ecosystems here. It provides a really unique geographical and ecological habitat for numerous species. In fact, this area was actually identified by E.O. Wilson recently in his book Half Earth as one of the most biologically diverse areas in the world and something that is key to protecting if we're going to maintain biological diversity across not only this continent but also across the world. And the way that we've done our work historically is that we work to bring together partners and stakeholders to sit together and discuss not only conservation planning, but also recommendations for things like agency management and to look forward and look for opportunities where we can do restoration work, where we can really impact habitat restoration on the ground and again, maintain connectivity. And just for one example of that is we had previously done back in 2005 and 2006, a number of meetings where we brought together stakeholders. This was NGOs, government agencies, other individuals interested in this subject, scientists, to come up with recommendations on border security activities for wildlife and habitat in southern Arizona specifically. And so I think the main important point here is that we are a partnership-based organization and that we really rely on local and regional partners to help implement our vision on the ground. While we look, again, at the more top level, continental scale vision, which is connecting the entire wildway, Western Wildway, or spine of the continent, all the way from Alaska down into Mexico. So one of the key ways in which we do our work is to focus on key endangered native species. There's a couple of reasons for this. And oftentimes these are carnivores, as are shown here. We have Mexican wolf and jaguar. The reasons for this are many, one of which is that these species are often charismatic. We've seen in the last year, if anyone's been following the news on jaguar in the US, that work by partners like the Center for Biological Diversity to spotlight these animals has really garnered a national audience. People find that these animals are very beautiful, and they really resonate with the public at large. And that allows us to spotlight not only the animals themselves, but the regions in which they live and the threats in those areas. For instance, roads or the border wall. And so when we look at these types of species and we look at their habitat needs, they're often wide-ranging species. These are animals that can move up to hundreds of miles for various reasons, looking for mates, habitat, water, etc. And so by focusing on the needs of those species and the threats that they are facing and trying to address those threats, we can really effectively protect habitat and movement for a wide range of species that are relying on the same areas. We also see with carnivores specifically that human conflict is a huge issue. And again, by trying to address those human conflict issues, we can hopefully address many of the same problems related to habitat fragmentation and threats to other species as well. And so it's a great way for us to focus on large landscapes, but also have a species that resonates with people and that we can really focus on communications-wise. So how do we actually start to address these threats? Well, for instance, one of the projects that I want to spotlight today is our work on Highway 2 in Mexico. Highway 2 is one of the major traffic transit arteries that runs in an east-west direction across the northern Mexico borderlands region. So step one for us is to identify areas of concern. And specifically here, what we've done and what you see on the map is that we've taken jaguar habitat modeling and we've looked at areas where that intersects with this road. And what we want to do is try to figure out how we can minimize the effect to jaguar movement from Highway 2. And of course, the breeding population of jaguars actually located in northern Mexico, ideally for recovery in the US, we would need to see breeding populations on both sides. And that can't happen if things like a road is impeding jaguar movement across this region. So we identify the areas of concern and the barrier to movement. And then what we do is engage partners and citizen scientists. So in this specific example of Highway 2, we've worked specifically with Skyland Alliance and Cueca Los Ojos in this Borderlands region. What you're seeing on the map, the GIF that you see here, is work that we did to identify areas with high rates of wildlife mortality, roadkill in essence. We did roadkill monitoring with citizen scientists through the partnerships with these organizations. And what this allows us to do is go beyond just the modeling and the knowledge that we know that because of the way that highways function, they are a barrier to wildlife movement. We get to actually get data on the ground. And it's data like this that we can then use to advance proposals for how we might mitigate the impacts from something like a highway on jaguar movement. And so in addition to getting data, what we're also doing through these types of partnerships is connecting people to a place. So using citizen scientists especially, what we see is an opportunity for community members to actually engage on conservation work in their backyard, to have a better understanding of what's at stake and a better sense that they are a part of the solution, which is really critically important. So then we see the next step, which is to actually influence government agencies to do something about this. So there's oftentimes private land issues as well, and we would work with, for instance, private landowners in that case. But for many of these issues, it's actually a government agency that we need to motivate to take action. And so in the case of Highway 2, what that's looked like is presentations like what is shown here in the photo on this slide. This is our Mexican program director, Juan Carlos Bravo, who's based out of Hermosillo. He's giving a presentation to a number of scientists and local and national transportation officials and other agency stakeholders on not only the issue of Highway 2, but also the broader issues of road ecology and the work that's being done in Mexico and Canada to resolve these issues. And the goal here is to present our data, present our expertise on these issues, and convince government agencies and stakeholders to get involved in this and to take action. And we think we've done that really effectively in the case of Highway 2, where we've actually been able to get buy-in from local agencies to do this type of work. And we also will do things like, for instance, on your right here is a photo of a mock-up of a potential wildlife crossing over Highway 2 that would be used by jaguar and many other species. This is the type of work that we can demonstrate, show these folks what this would mean on the ground, and then work with them to try to implement that vision. And so we really have this three-step approach of identifying a threat, working with our partners and hopefully citizen scientists or other scientific entities, gathering data and figuring out a solution to this problem, and then going to government agencies and officials and influencing them to actually take action here. And this has been very successful on Highway 2. Couple of the next steps just in the near term that we look forward to on this project. Juan Carlos is actually going to be presenting on this topic in Mexico City. This issue of road ecology and highway crossings is in Mexico. There are congressional delegates there that are interested in this topic. So he'll be presenting to them. And we'll also be continuing our road monitoring work with Skyland Alliance and engaging other citizen scientists and scientists in this work as well. In addition, since again, we are a binational organization, we're looking at this road ecology work and highway barriers in the US as well. And one of our next steps is to also be working with partners like the Coalition for Snow and Desert Protection in Arizona to identify ways that we can start to have this conversation and move the discussion forward for I-10 in the US as well, which, as many of you know, is the main artery that goes east-west from Tucson all the way over to El Paso. So those are a couple of the things that we're looking forward with Highway 2. But so far, this work has been very successful, and it's something that we intend to continue and replicate as much as possible. So the next big issue that we look at in the borderlands, and again, highways and walls, these are just two of the many, many things that we are looking at, but I think they're really relevant today, and they're the ones I wanted to focus on. So the other key issue here that we're looking at is the border wall. Obviously, this region is, as I showed you before, it's ecologically diverse, and it's crosses habitat and wildlife movement crosses the border. The border is a political boundary that we've established. It has no bearing on the actual ecological needs of habitat or species in this area. And so unfortunately, by creating this very impenetrable barrier, we've had a significant impact on wildlife in the region. And I just wanted to show a couple of examples here on this slide of ways in which that impact has been felt. We have direct issues with direct impacts on wildlife movement. You see here some deer and a frog, maybe a toad, that are being prevented from moving across the border because of the wall. These animals move oftentimes to find water, again, to find mates, to find habitat. This is a very arid region, so it's really critical that they be able to move effectively across the landscape. And we see a number of different types of wildlife mortality caused directly by the wall. In addition to the direct impacts on wildlife movement, what we're also seeing is the indirect impacts to the larger landscape. When they build these walls, there's obviously as you can see in many of these photos, a road that is associated with that. There's the clearing of the landscape to do construction, and then that clearing and that road is then maintained indefinitely for Border Patrol access. So you can see how that's very destructive to the landscape. It's a clear fragmentation issue, even if a wall wasn't in place on the border. And then we also see impacts like the bottom middle photo, where we see significant flooding, even in areas where they have a bollard or steel pole design for the wall. Oftentimes debris in flash flooding events, which is very common in this region, debris will push up against the wall and water will get trapped behind it. And we saw this we see this in many areas. This example is just specifically in Nogales in an urban area. This flooding actually, unfortunately, caused the deaths of a number of people on the Mexican side of the border. But it's very destructive even in our public lands and other less urban areas where we see erosion and we see significant impacts to water flow within the borderlands. And then finally, I just want to show the sort of associated impacts of the wall. This is the Otay Mountain Wilderness area in California. It's a designated wilderness area. This is an access road that was built by Border Patrol to access the border. So it's not even the wall itself, but the destruction that's happening because of associated border security activities. And what's important to note, because I'm sure many of you are thinking, well, this is a wilderness area. How did this happen in a wilderness area? In 2005, Congress passed statutory authority that allows the Department of Homeland Security to unilaterally waive any legal requirement. That's actually the phrasing in the text of the statute, to waive any legal requirement in order to build and maintain these walls. And so they were able to waive the Wilderness Act. They're able to waive the Endangered Species Act. They can waive NEPA and pretty much any other federal requirement related to the environment or species. And what that means is that there's little to no public input on these projects, very minimal environmental review, and we oftentimes will see things like this destruction happening in a wilderness area. So it's a really critical piece of legislation that passed back in 2005, has gone really unnoticed by many people, but it's creating these enormous impacts in addition to just the wall itself. So what are we doing about this? Well, again, our approach has been to bring together stakeholders because we know that we alone as an organization, excuse me, that we alone as an organization cannot tackle this by ourselves. And so what I'm showing here is a number of the organizations that we work with right now on this issue. And what we've done in the past year is actually I organized and co-hosted a meeting with over 35 representatives from local, regional, and national environmental, social justice, and community groups that took place in Tucson, Arizona in February of 2007. What we did at that meeting is talk about the various aspects of border walls and border security and the impacts to the environment of the groups that were involved in this issue, but to develop stronger and more diverse partnerships, to maintain a dialogue moving forward so that we were coordinated in a way that hadn't happened on the national level on this issue in many years, and to develop concrete strategies for fighting the wall. And obviously this border wall has been an issue for many, many decades, but most obviously in the 2016 election and then with the election of Donald Trump, we saw a renewed push for additional wall. And so it's something that we've been fighting against for many years, but because of this renewed attention and the potential for additional funding and additional construction, a number of people have rallied around this issue, and we've gotten a lot more people to come to the table. And the types of strategies that were identified were things like lawsuits. So there are partners that specialize in legal action that have filed lawsuits when a wall has been proposed or when a waiver has been issued. We've been doing a number of lobbying days on Capitol Hill, and we have a great policy director, Susan Holmes in DC, who we work with on this issue as well. But we have partners across the spectrum of interest groups who are coming together and organizing lobbying days that have continuously been happening since late. We also have coalition letters where up to hundreds of groups are signing on to these opposing the border wall, which go directly to Congress. And in essence, this is just a coordinated response. We maintain this group that is functioning across the country and being really effective in stimulating opposition across the border region and also in DC. And some of the specific things that Wildlands Network has done, we wrote and collected over 50 organizational signatures for a letter during the most recent debate in January and February, where there was a number of bills being proposed on immigration and border security. And we were able to get a letter from over 50 organizations nationally that went directly to congressional representatives, and then there were follow-up meetings from that. And we also helped organize a number of social media action days using the No Border Wall hashtag, which has been amplified across social media. Now, I can't say that that we are completely winning this and that we've seen only success. Obviously, in the last budget that was passed on Friday and signed into law, there was $1.6 billion for the wall, and specifically for wall construction in areas in California and areas in Texas, but it has made a difference. The Santa Ana Wildlife Refuge was specifically exempted from wall construction, and that was a huge focus for us and many of the coalition partners in opposition to the wall. A lot of mobilization that went into that, a lot of work that was done to specifically spotlight the threats to the Santa Ana National Wildlife Refuge in Texas. So, and additionally, the president and many Republicans were pushing for upwards of $25 billion for the wall, and hoping to also see the implementation of some of those ridiculous concrete structures that he is building out as prototypes in the desert. And none of that was included in this bill. So it's not great that we have 1.6 billion in this budget, but it's much lower than what I think we would have seen even a year ago. And we've effectively mobilized a number of congressional champions and made this a real issue that is hard for Democrats, for instance, to vote for wall funding, whereas in many previous cases and in the last couple decades, there was no real pushback on their support for these efforts. So what else are we doing? Step 2 here for us is not, beyond just bringing together stakeholders, is to add our expertise and perspective to the conversation. The way that we did this specifically on the border wall is to produce a report called For Species on the Brink. This report is available on our website, and I encourage all of you to go and look at it if you haven't already. But our approach here was to take 4 species, again, the charismatic species, endangered species in this region. We looked at the Sonoran pronghorn, jaguar, black bear, and Mexican wolf. All of these species have a habitat on both sides of the border and require the ability to move between that habitat in order to recover and survive in the Borderlands region. And we saw this report, we published this report, we sent it to media outlets, we made sure it made it into congressional offices. We had our Borderlands program coordinator, Miles Trapphagen, go to DC and actually talk specifically to congressional staff and members about our report and about these issues. What we found is that many congressional offices and media and people across this country have no idea of the types of native plants and wildlife that exist on the border, and they don't understand the environmental impacts of the wall. A lot of people see various images that show a sort of denuded desert landscape, which is obviously not what is an accurate portrayal of the Borderlands. So we really feel like this information is important to get in the hands of decision makers and spotlight for the public at large. And so what we saw from this report actually was great. We saw specifically Senator Heinrich out of New Mexico mentioned these 4 species specifically in an opinion piece that he did against the wall. We also saw, with the help of partners, that some of the areas that we identified as key corridor areas across the border were identified in an amendment to one of the border security bills, and it would have precluded wall construction in those areas because of their wildlife corridor values. So this information is having an impact in DC, and we feel like the more that we can do to spotlight this type of information, which again isn't well known, is something that we can add to this conversation and really bolster the argument against the wall. And so finally, step 3 here is moving beyond the talking points that are coming out of DC, beyond the rhetoric. This is just an example of a number of the stories that covered either our report or quoted us when talking about the border wall and the impacts to the environment. We've also organized events like the Border BioBlitz, which took place in March, where we helped bring together a number of citizen scientists across the border from California to Texas to use the iNaturalist app and identify and catalog the native species that exist along the border. And the goal here is to change the perception of the border and to spotlight its value ecologically, its value as a biodiversity hotspot, and also show and demonstrate the level of binational cooperation that's happening on the issues of conservation, and how a wall and other types of fragmentation would really threaten those activities and threaten the progress that's been made. And so through doing more of this, which is what we hope to do in the coming years, we hope to really start to change that conversation and also inspire local communities to stand up against this devastating project. So what's next? In 2017, obviously, we've done a lot of good work. In addition to the projects that I've shown you, some of the highlights, we received additional grant funding to support our work in the Borderlands, which allowed us to hire an experienced scientist and conservationist named Miles Traphagen as our Borderlands program coordinator, and he is based out of Tucson, Arizona. That has significantly increased our ability to engage on the ground, to look at different types of research projects, engage with coalitions, attend events. It's made a huge difference in our impact, and we look forward to continuing to build out the program with additional staff capacity in the future. We also grew our network of partners and collaborators, both locally in Arizona and New Mexico, but also nationally. And we have many of those partners now come to us for information about the science and about the ecology of the borderlands, which is really fantastic. We're also seeing additional reporter engagement and interest from media in covering both our events and the information that we're sharing. So in 2018, we're looking forward to doing more to bring diverse stakeholders together at meetings and conferences, specifically scientific conferences in the area and nationally, to discuss how we move forward on next steps. We know there are a lot of data gaps and a lot of gaps in networking, especially when you look at the cross-border collaboration. And since we have staff in both the US and Mexico, we see ourselves as having a unique role to fill in the gap for networking and also data gathering. We also look forward to meeting and cultivating more congressional champions for Borderlands wildlife. As I said, many people, if they're not from the Borderlands region especially, have very little idea of what actually is happening in the Borderlands. So we need to meet with them. We need to give them more information. We also will probably likely see some new people in office after the 2018 election. So that's going to be a huge opportunity for us to get in the door with them and start to communicate our vision and the importance of protecting Borderlands habitat. In addition, we're going to be pursuing new research projects. I just want to show you, to wrap this up, a couple of sort of a teaser of the types of things that we're going to be seeing coming out of our research in the Borderlands. These images are from some camera traps that we are going to be setting up in northern Mexico, and we hope to have more information, more communications materials like this, more wildlife data that we can use to help with our restoration and corridor protection work. There's some javelina family that's jumping on through. And we also are looking at different future projects, including tracking wildlife movement and behavior next to highways, looking at additional ways to track native species presence down at the Borderlands, looking at how changes to habitat has happened over time, as well as how we can do better conservation planning and restoration on private lands in Mexico. So those are just a few of the different things that we're pursuing and that we're hoping to get additional support for. And I just want to wrap up before we go to questions, just by saying thank you to all of you. We really couldn't do any of this work without your support. All of these issues require public engagement, public input, whether that's through a citizen scientist on the ground role, whether it's by writing to a member of Congress, whether it's through financial support for our programs. We really have a lean and mean operation, and so every dollar, every investment in our work makes a huge difference and allows us to do a lot more, since what we also are seeing is that our work and the work of our partners is amplified every time we take these actions. So I just wanted to thank you for all of the support that you've given us, and we hope that you'll stick with us and continue to track our progress. And I'm always happy to, as well as any of our other staff, to answer questions you have about our work, or anything that comes out of our communications materials. We're happy to follow up with you directly as well. So with that, I just want to jump to questions and see if we've had any questions come in, and hopefully I can answer those to the best of my ability. So let me see if I'm going to open my questions portal and see what we have coming in. Okay, so the first thing I see here, the question, I'll read them aloud. Says, Katie, can you talk about how Wildlands thinks strategically about opposing a border wall versus advocating for wildlife permeability in any wall that might be built? Although personally I don't like the border wall, I have also concerns about whether Wildlands is best positioned by taking an anti-wall position. So we certainly think that, just bottom line, any type of border barrier is a barrier to wildlife. And again, as I mentioned, we've seen direct wildlife mortality from border walls. So we know that this is an issue that's affecting wildlife, and we don't feel that we can effectively preserve habitat connectivity and landscape connectivity in the Borderlands region if we have barriers that prevent wildlife movement. So we're going to maintain our anti-wall stance. What I will say is that we know, for instance, that there are already nearly 700 miles of wall structures that have been built on the border. There are potentially opportunities to for Border Patrol to change those existing structures so that they are more wildlife friendly. That's very hard to do with the existing way that the Border Patrol approaches this and the existing structures they use, but there's potential there, and that's something that we actually directly try to engage Border Patrol on. Because there is no public process, it's very hard to try to get new ideas or identify ways to have less impact for wildlife for any structures that are built, but we try to go directly to the Border Patrol and the people who are looking at this and try to advocate that they change structures to be more wildlife friendly. And there have been various proposals of how that might be accomplished. But so far we haven't seen a lot of buy-in to that issue. So it's something that we're thinking about, and certainly when they are thinking about maintaining existing walls. But in general, we feel that the best position is to advocate for no wall, which is certainly the best outcome for all wildlife down on the border. The second question I have here is, what is the name of the book by E.O. Wilson that mentions the Sky Islands? That book is called Half Earth. It actually was released, I don't know if it was last year or the year before, but it's fairly recent. That's one of E.O. Wilson's most recent books, so I would recommend checking it out. It's very informative and spotlights a number of issues or areas around the world. Third question here, can you make these slides available to those of us on the webinar? So we actually will make this, the recording of this webinar available. So everybody should have access to that. And we can look for ways to make the slides themselves available. But I also encourage anyone who wants to get any of the specific photos or information to just contact me directly via email, and I'd be happy to make sure that you can get your hands on that. Let's see, the next question. Could some of the existing border walls be removed if it becomes politically feasible? I would say definitely. I mean, we've seen walls that have been constructed across the world be torn down once it's realized that they are not effective or the political winds change. I think that is certainly, I think, a long-term possibility. I wouldn't say in the short term, even with the new administration, that we would see that. Obviously, Obama had no interest in tearing down walls, and in fact, there was construction of border wall under his term. I would expect the same thing to occur unless we have a significant sea change in the politics in this country. But I think, again, what we're trying to do is change the narrative of the Borderlands so that eventually we can have the type of political change and public change in perception that will allow us to dismantle walls in places where they exist, especially in areas where they're significantly impacting public lands and wildlife. So I would say that's definitely a long-term vision. And something that's not out of the realm of possibility, as we've seen it happen elsewhere. And that's certainly, something that we'll continue to look at if we can. Another question, what's the most recent news about large carnivores in the Borderlands and the Southwest in general? So a couple of things. I mean, in terms of jaguars, we know that in the last couple of years, there's been a few males that have been tracked by camera trap that have crossed into the US. How we differentiate or how we tell that they're different is actually by the spot pattern. That's how scientists identify a unique jaguar. So we know that there are unique males that have crossed into the US. There are no known females that have crossed, and the breeding population is fairly far north, so that's unlikely that there's a female and we just don't know about it. But that's obviously a significant issue right now, is trying to figure out how we can get breeding populations of jaguars up into the US, and many proposals have been floated. Our concern right now is protecting as much habitat and open permeable landscape as possible to facilitate that return to the US. In terms of Mexican wolves, there were additional Mexican wolves released in northern Mexico recently. You can actually find video of that online. But the Mexican wolf recovery program remains a challenge on both sides of the border. Wolves generally have larger human conflict issues, especially with livestock and ranchers, than jaguars do. So that's a real struggle. And again, that's happening on both sides. We see rancher conflicts with wolves. But we're hopeful that with a new recovery plan out of Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as some additional emphasis on the Mexican wolf recovery program and some new releases, that program can continue, and that eventually we will see successful populations in both countries. I also note that there have been wolves in the last couple of years that have been tracked moving across the border. So we know that that's happening. They're usually captured and then sent back to where they came from. But there is potential there, and we feel like if we can maintain the permeability, that long-term we can see the success of the Mexican wolf program on both sides of the border. Another question, are there initiatives for the border between Texas and the Mexican state of Chihuahua? So that's a good question. We definitely have partners that are looking across the entire border. Our focus, just because of the geography of the Western Wildway, is primarily in Arizona and New Mexico. But there's definitely interest in that in the Texas, in Texas connectivity. We have public lands like the Santa Ana Wildlife Refuge, as well as Big Bend National Park. So I think that there are a number of groups working on those issues, and we actually try to collaborate as much as possible with them and spotlight those issues. But I don't know specifically who would be the primary group working on that. Sierra Club's been very active in the area. Defenders of Wildlife tracks this issue across the border as well. So that might be a good place to start if you're interested. And I'm sure Juan Carlos, if you wanted to email him, would also know some Mexican partners that are doing work in that area. How receptive have you found the Mexican authorities to building wildlife crossings over Highway 2? Are there any particular methods used to direct wildlife to these crossings, or are you relying primarily on placement of the crossings based on high mortality rates? So we've actually found, and Juan Carlos could speak to this better than I can, as he's been directly involved, but we've found that Mexican authorities are very receptive to this idea. In fact, most transportation officials across both countries are very receptive to the idea of wildlife crossings. In general, the biggest issue is funding. And so that's a barrier that we're trying to get over both in the US and Mexico. But there's a lot of buy-in and there's a lot of interest, and we're really excited about that. And then as to particular methods to direct wildlife, one is that we do rely a lot on the placement. If we know that there's a lot of mortality happening in a specific area, usually measured by mile markers or something like that, that's obviously an ideal place to put a crossing. Most animals behaviorally will continue to use the same pathways over and over again. So that's key to a project. But there's also usually wildlife fencing that is also incorporated into these projects. And that's the idea, is to funnel wildlife to the crossing. And again, because these are behavioral, learned behaviors for movement, what you often see is that initially it takes some of the animals a while to figure out where to cross, but they want to avoid traffic, they want to avoid the light and the noise. They see a more open pathway across these crossings or these underpasses, and so they'll end up using that, and then they teach their young, and then it's continued to be used by large communities of wildlife. And we have camera trapping data from many projects that have happened across the US that show the success of these projects. So we know that these techniques work, and we work with scientists who have designed and implemented these projects to make sure that there's consistency and that we're really using the best available science. There's also a Half-Earth project put together by E.O. Wilson's Biodiversity Foundation. Yes, so E.O. Wilson's book, Half-Earth, was actually sort of his public expression of the need to preserve half of Earth for wildlife. And there's also a Half-Earth project, which is something that we are also aware of and engaged in. And that's to implement his vision on a global scale. And so I encourage people to check out that project as well. Lots of information available online on that. You have talked about apex predators and a few other mammals. Have there been tracking of birds and reptiles? So yes, we haven't done, Wildlands Network itself hasn't done as much work on birds, but this is something that Audubon has been very focused on. They actually released a really incredible modeling imagery mapping in the last year, I believe, that showed migratory pathways and movement for birds, as well as with predicted impacts of climate change, avian movement. So that's something that we're definitely tracking, that we're looking at. We also know that for the border wall specifically, there's species like the pygmy owl that are directly impacted by the wall because they only fly about 10 feet off the ground. And there are researchers doing that work in the Borderlands region. There's actually a collection of researchers that are called Next Gen researchers that are working on these types of issues, that are doing different directed research projects on a number of species. So there's definitely work being done. Again, we just focus on a few key species, but we, in general, try to get as much data as possible and work as much as we can on a whole host of species. What public forums are available to meet with DHS regarding border infrastructure, future plans, or redesign? Any right now? Excuse me. No public forums as of right now. I will say that in some of the wall proposals for Texas, DHS or the Border Patrol, I'm not sure which agency or entity was specifically leading them, but they did open up a sort of public comment period or public engagement period. And I believe they had some meetings in addition to just allowing people to send in emails or something. I haven't seen anything like that happen in Arizona or New Mexico. There's not right now any proposed, as far as I know, off the top of my head, any projects that are moving forward for new construction. So it's possible that if that was to happen, I could see them maybe sort of opening up a token comment period or public engagement session. But in general, they don't need to do it, and there's really no, I see no sort of political reason why they would try to do that at this point. But if something like that were to happen, I can guarantee you we would be putting that information out, and we'd be connecting with partners and making sure that the public and our points of view are heard for sure. Are there projects focused on invasive species across the border? That's a very good question. So I'm not sure. That would not be something that I'm directly familiar with. I do know, and our Borderlands project program coordinator, Miles Trapp-Hagan, I'm sure would have a lot of information on this for you. We do know that there's a number of efforts on both private and public land in the US to deal with bufflegrass and other invasive species issues through grassland restoration. I believe that work is probably happening on both sides of the border, and it's something that obviously we'll be looking at as we do conservation planning and restoration in Mexico as well. So I think there's probably a number of initiatives. I'm just not the most familiar with them, but I would really urge you to contact Miles, and his email is just miles@wildlandsnetwork.org. If you have questions about that, I'm sure he could help you. And it looks like those are all of the questions that have come in. So I'll just open it up. If people have other questions, feel free to type in your questions. But again, we'll make this webinar available for future viewing, and all of you will have, I believe, the recording as well as the ability to take action. And what we're looking for right now, specifically in our Borderlands program, Take Action, is to sign a petition if you haven't already. It's a petition against the border wall. We're collecting signatures, and what we use that as an indication to members of Congress specifically that the public opposes the border wall. At the end of the day, Congress is who is going to appropriate funding for this. Congress has the ability to stop this from happening. Congress has the ability to rescind the waiver authority, and I talked about earlier that's so destructive. So we're really looking at approaching and convincing members of Congress to take action on this issue. And so I encourage you to sign on to our petition. You can also contact your representatives directly. And I believe there's a few resources on our Facebook page that you could use to figure out who your representatives are and to contact them. directly on this issue and just expressing your support for Borderlands conservation. As well, I would really encourage those of you who are interested and want to continue to support our work to sign up for our newsletters and to donate to our organization. And those resources are readily available, I believe, right on the front page of our website, and will also be spotlighted in the follow-up email. Oh, so it looks like that's all of the questions, and I really just want to say again, thank you all for joining us. I hope this was informative. I hope you'll be looking forward to lots of additional resources and actions and projects that we'll be undertaking in the Borderlands region in the next year or so. And by all means, feel free to reach out to me. My email, again, is k.davis@wildlandsnetwork.org, and I'm always happy to talk to anybody about the work that we're doing along the Western Wildway. So thank you so much, and I think with that, we'll end today's webinar.